11,000 years ago, in a cave tucked into the Tehachapi Mountains of what is now Southern California, someone chewed a handful of leaves and pressed their back against the stone wall to wait. The leaves were dry, bitter, hard to work through without practice. The plant is Datura wrightii, and its active dose margin is narrow enough that the difference between a visionary experience and a lethal one can be measured in grams. The person waiting in that cave understood this. They had almost certainly been taught by someone who had already survived the calculation and arrived at the correct amount through a tradition of carefully accumulated knowledge passed down across generations. When the alkaloids moved through them, the walls did things walls do not normally do. At some point, before or after, someone painted the ceiling. Red and white rings, spiraling outward from a single center point. Concentric. Still there. In 2020, archaeologist David Robinson and a team at the University of Central Lancashire published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Inside that cave in the Tehachapi Range, worked directly into the ceiling beside those paintings, they found chewed plant fibers of Datura, pressed against the stone and saturated with pigment. The art and the substance and the ritual had occupied the same space, in the same ceremony, for thousands of years. Today, the alkaloids in Datura are controlled substances in multiple countries across Europe and North America. Ingesting the plant for psychoactive effects runs into criminal law in most Western jurisdictions. What was happening in that cave, under the laws we currently live by, was a crime. And Datura is the least of it. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. When people picture what ancient humans ate, the default image tends to be manageable. Roasted meat, dried fruit, roots pulled from the ground. That image is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. Buried in cave ceilings and ancient ritual containers and the chemical residue left inside pottery thousands of years old, there is evidence of a diet that no modern legal system would sanction. This is not a story about reckless people who didn't know better. Many of them understood these substances with a precision that most modern users never approach. The question is, what happened in the space between then and now, and why the things that once sat at the center of ceremony, medicine, and survival became criminal under legal codes we now treat as permanent. The answer divides into two categories. The first is plants and fungi with psychoactive properties, consumed not for casual pleasure, but as the mechanism of ritual, healing, and a kind of altered perception that entire civilizations organized themselves around. These substances now carry Schedule I classifications and felony-level possession charges in much of the world. The second is quieter and harder to sit with. It is the animals, the species that ancient coastal peoples and prehistoric hunters fed on for tens of thousands of years, until the rest of human history made those animals endangered. The law didn't protect them because ancient humans ate them. It protected them because modern humans nearly finished what ancient humans started. Start with the plants. The oldest physical evidence for the ritual use of psilocybin mushrooms does not come from cave paintings. It comes from carved stone. Across archaeological sites in Guatemala and southern Mexico, researchers have recovered more than 200 stone mushroom effigies, some dating back roughly 3,000 years. The carvings are not ambiguous: a mushroom cap, and emerging from beneath it, a human face, or a figure that sits somewhere between a person and something else. In the 16th century, the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún documented Aztec ceremonial practice in a text called the Florentine Codex. He recorded mushrooms called Teonanacatl, translated from Nahuatl as flesh of the gods, distributed at major ceremonies under careful supervision. He was describing a practice that had been running for centuries before he arrived. The stone suggests it. Psilocybin binds to serotonin receptors in the prefrontal cortex and disrupts what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the region of the brain that generates and maintains your ordinary sense of self. At significant doses, what results is not a distortion of what you perceive. It is a dissolution of the perspective from which all perception normally operates. Ancient peoples who worked with these mushrooms did not have this vocabulary, but they understood what happened inside the experience reliably enough to build stone monuments in its image and pass the method down for centuries. Under the United States Controlled Substances Act, psilocybin is Schedule I, the same schedule as heroin. Possession carries federal felony charges. A ceremonial specialist doing in modern Oaxaca exactly what their counterparts did 3,000 years earlier would be committing a federal crime. Some researchers also point to cave paintings at Tassili Naajer in Algeria, roughly 7,000 years old, as possible evidence of even earlier mushroom-related ritual. Other archaeologists read those figures differently. as insects, as human figures in movement, as something unconnected to fungi entirely. The interpretation is genuinely contested, and that is worth being honest about. The Mesoamerican evidence is archaeological and chemical. The rock art readings involve considerably more ambiguity. In 2019, a team led by Yimin Yang published findings in Science Advances from a burial site called Zhizangkal, located at roughly 3,000 meters elevation in the Pamir Mountains of western China. The site dates to approximately 500 BCE. Inside the cemetery, the researchers analyzed wooden braziers, small shallow basins designed to hold burning material. The residue inside came from cannabis plants with THC concentrations substantially elevated above what wild cannabis produces naturally. Someone had cultivated the plant for its psychoactive properties and was burning it as part of burial ceremony. Cannabis cultivation for fiber and seed goes back at least 6,000 years in East Asia. Industrial hemp, grown for rope and cloth, with minimal psychoactive effect. That is a separate history. The Zhizangkal finding is the clearest physical evidence to date for deliberate selection and use of high-potency cannabis, specifically for its effects on the mind. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, describes Scythian peoples on the Eurasian steppe throwing cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside sealed felt tents, inhaling the vapor, and emerging, in his words, shouting for joy. For years, historians debated whether Herodotus was reporting something observed or something he had merely heard. The chemistry from Zhizangkal suggests it was an established and documented practice. Cannabis remains federally classified as Schedule I in the United States. It is illegal in the majority of countries on Earth. A burial ceremony conducted in the Pamir Mountains in 500 BCE would, performed anywhere in Europe or most of Asia today, result in criminal prosecution. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The third plant is one most people today would recognize by sight, and probably not immediately name correctly. Amanita muscaria, the red-capped mushroom with white spots. It appears in medieval manuscript illustrations, in children's picture books, and in Northern European winter decorations across cultures that had no contact with each other. It grows across boreal forest zones stretching from Siberia through Scandinavia to the Pacific Northwest of North America. And in the cultures most consistently associated with its range, it appears to have been consumed deliberately as a chemical key to states that shamanic traditions required. The primary psychoactive compounds are muscimol and ibotenic acid. When ingested, ibotenic acid partly converts in the body to muscimol, which acts on GABA receptors rather than the serotonin system, making it pharmacologically distinct from psilocybin. The experience is distinct too. Less visual, more sedative, with episodes of vivid dissociative dreaming. Some accounts from documented users describe a felt separation between body and awareness, not as a metaphor but as a physical experience, indistinguishable from waking reality while it is happening. Documented ceremonial use among Siberian shamanic cultures, particularly among Evenki and Koryak peoples, was first recorded by European travelers in the 17th century. These were not accounts of recreational indulgence. They described a specific practice embedded in particular roles. Certain people were responsible for preparation and administration, in the way a pharmacist and a physician are not the same role. The scholar R. Gordon Wasson proposed in 1968 that Amanita muscaria might also be the identity of Soma, the sacred ritual beverage described in the ancient Vedic texts of India. That hypothesis is actively debated. The documented Siberian use is not. The active compound muscimol is a Schedule IX prohibited substance in Australia, classified at the same regulatory tier as heroin and enema. The legal status of the mushroom varies significantly by country, but in several major legal systems, consuming it for psychoactive effects runs into controlled substance law. This one involves a city, not a cave. For roughly 2,000 years, from approximately 1500 BCE until 392 CE, thousands of people traveled each September to the town of Eleusis, about 12 miles west of Athens, to undergo what ancient accounts consistently describe as one of the most transformative experiences available to a human being. The ceremony was the Eleusinian Mysteries. Plato attended. Cicero wrote about it with a reverence unusual even for him, arguing that what he encountered there had done more for Athens than any law or military victory. Initiates came from across the ancient Mediterranean world, and were strictly prohibited from describing what they experienced. What is known with certainty is that at some point in the ceremony, Participants drank a beverage called kikion, made from barley, water, and pennyroyal mint. In 1978, 3 researchers published a short but consequential book called The Road to Eleusis. The authors were R. Gordon Wasson, who had spent decades studying ritual plant use across cultures, Carl Ruck, a classicist at Boston University, and Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had first synthesized LSD. Their argument was precise. Ergot, a fungal parasite that grows on barley and rye, contains compounds chemically related to lysergic acid. A barley preparation contaminated with ergot and correctly processed to remove the toxic elements while preserving the psychoactive ones would produce a drink capable of generating exactly the kind of experience ancient accounts of the mysteries consistently describe. In recent years, chemical analysis at Mas Castellar de Pontos in northeastern Spain, a sanctuary site directly associated with the goddess Demeter, at the center of the religious tradition the mysteries belong to, found traces of ergot alkaloids inside a ritual vessel alongside processed barley. This does not prove what happened at Eleusis, but it demonstrates that the combination of barley and ergot existed in Demeter cult ritual contexts in the ancient Mediterranean, centuries before any of those compounds had a scientific name. LSD is a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States. The ceremony at Eleusis, attended across 2,000 years by some of the most documented individuals in ancient Greek civilization, involved consuming something that modern narcotics law would classify as a serious criminal violation. Here is where the record goes somewhere most people are not prepared for from a conversation about diet. In 2011, Sylvia Bello and colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London published a study in the Journal of Human Evolution. The subject was 14,700-year-old human remains from Gough's Cave in Somerset, England. The bones belonged to anatomically modern humans, people genetically close to us. What the researchers documented was not just evidence of cannibalism, it was evidence of a skilled, systematic process. The bones had been defleshed, the marrow had been extracted, and 3 human skulls had been carefully shaped into bowls. The edges had been trimmed, the interior surfaces had been cleaned and smoothed. This required patience, precision, and a clear intention about what the finished objects were for. The record goes back considerably further than Gough's Cave. At El Cidrón in northern Spain, the bones of at least 13 Neanderthals, including children, show cut marks in patterns identical to those found on deer bones from the same site. The same species was processed using the same sequence: defleshed, marrow extracted, the useful material removed. At Moula-Guercy in France, published by Alban de Fleur and colleagues in Science in 1999, Neanderthal remains from approximately 100,000 years ago and show unmistakable evidence of the same procedure. Researchers debate the motivation. Nutritional cannibalism, consuming human flesh because other food was unavailable, is supported by the El Cidrón and Moula-Guercy evidence. Ritual cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh as part of ceremony or social practice, is harder to dismiss at Gough's Cave, where skull cups suggest a purpose beyond simple caloric intake. Most legal systems have no single law specifically against cannibalism. It is prosecuted through statutes on murder, desecration of a corpse, and related offenses. In practical terms, it is illegal in every modern jurisdiction. The skull cups from Gough's Cave now sit in the Natural History Museum in London. The people who made them were not acting outside the norms of their world. They were living in a world that had not yet invented the concept this would eventually require. The shift from plants to animals is a shift in what kind of illegal we are talking about. Ancient coastal humans ate sea turtles. Not occasionally, not as an emergency supplement. As a consistent and significant protein source wherever coastal peoples and sea turtles shared the same coastline, which included most of the world's tropical and subtropical shores. Archaeological evidence for sea turtle consumption appears along the South African coast, across the Arabian Peninsula, and throughout the wider Pacific, stretching back tens of thousands of years. At Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, research led by Curtis Marine and published in Nature in 2007 documented systematic marine resource exploitation by early modern humans dating to approximately 164,000 years ago. Sea turtle remains appear with regularity across the Old World coastal Paleolithic record. All 7 living sea turtle species are now listed on Appendix I of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the highest level of protection, reserved for species facing the greatest risk of extinction. Under the United States Endangered Species Act, taking, pursuing, or killing one is a federal crime. The hawksbill sea turtle has lost an estimated 80 to 90% of its global population over the last century. Ancient coastal peoples ate sea turtles for over 100,000 years without measurably threatening their populations. The scale was different, the technology was different, but the species is the same. The same observation extends further. Cave bears hunted across Europe for tens of thousands of years are now extinct. Woolly mammoths fed populations across Eurasia and North America throughout most of the Pleistocene before disappearing around 10,000 years ago on the mainland. Aurochs, the wild ancestor of all modern cattle, were hunted continuously across Europe and Western Asia until the last individual died in the Datura forest in Poland in 1627. Giant ground sloths, some weighing as much as modern elephants, fed human populations across the Americas before vanishing around 10,000 years ago. If any of these animals had survived to the present, consuming them would be prohibited under endangered species law. In several cases, even the fossil remains are protected as paleontological heritage, meaning the bones in the ground belong, legally, to the state. Ancient humans did not make these animals extinct, but in most cases, they were present at the beginning of the process that eventually did. Here is the thing worth sitting with after going through all of it. None of this was illegal at the time. Not the mushrooms, not the cannabis, not the kykeon at Eleusis, not the skull cups from Gough's cave, not the sea turtles pulled from warm, shallow water. None of it. The concept of a controlled substance did not exist. The concept of an endangered species did not exist. The legal architecture that makes these things criminal is, by any historical measure, extraordinarily recent. The United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs was signed in 1961. The United States Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970. The International Whaling Commission moratorium on commercial whaling came in 1986. The frameworks governing most of what appears on this list are less than 70 years old. What you have when you look at the full list is not a record of ancient recklessness. It is a record of what modernity decided it needed to manage, and why. The psychoactive plant laws were built primarily on political reasoning. Researchers had not established that psilocybin, cannabis, or ergot alkaloids were more dangerous than alcohol, which remained legal throughout. What had been established was that altering consciousness outside government-sanctioned channels was something modern states wanted to control. Ancient peoples altered consciousness inside very specific channels too: ritual, ceremony, initiation, healing. But those were not the channels the law was designed around, and the law was not built to accommodate practices older than it by several thousand years. The animal protections tell a different story. Sea turtles are endangered now because of industrial-scale egg collection, commercial fishing bycatch, coastal development, and a global human population that expanded ninefold in 2 centuries and consumed marine resources at a rate no ecosystem had evolved to absorb. The laws that make it a federal crime to harm a sea turtle are not punishing the people who ate them at Pinnacle Point 164,000 years ago. They are a response to everything that happened after those people. Here is the inversion the whole list carries. The things ancient humans ate that would be illegal today became illegal because of modernity, not because of anything ancient humans did. The plants they used carefully, under expert guidance built through generations of practice, were criminalized. The animals they ate without threatening for 100,000 years were protected after industrial civilization drove them to the edge. The list is not evidence that ancient humans were more dangerous than we are. It may be evidence of exactly the opposite. The cave in the Tehachapi Mountains is still there. The paintings on the ceiling are still there. Red and white rings, faded but readable, spiraling outward from a center that has been in that position for 11,000 years. The Datura still grows in the canyon below. The person who pressed their back against that wall and waited was not doing something outside the order of their world. They were doing something embedded in it. The ritual, the plant, the art, the knowledge of how much was too much, and what happened when you respected the dose, all of it was part of a community's accumulated understanding of what this experience was and what it was for. They thought it important enough to record in permanent pigment on stone. They passed the method down. What changed was not the cave. What changed was not the plant. What changed was the category we decided to put it in, and the legal consequence we attached to that category. We carry the biology these experiences were built around, the serotonin receptors that psilocybin finds so readily, the liver pathways that process THC, the GABA receptors that mucimol targets. The neurological architecture that responds to these compounds was present in human bodies tens of thousands of years before any law named them. It was shaped by a world where these substances existed in the environment. where the challenge was not avoiding them, but learning how to use them without dying. The people in that cave in the Tehachapi Mountains had solved that problem. They left the answer in the ceiling. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.